Denis Davidov was a bold Russian warrior, poet, and rebel, a true adventurer who lived for battle and storytelling. He led daring guerrilla raids against Napoleon, changing Russia's military tactics forever. His poetry was wild and full of life, earning praise from great writers like Pushkin. Though his writings were censored, his legacy endured. This memoir, now fully translated into English for the first time, brings his thrilling first-hand stories to life. His battlefield victories, his fearless tactics, and his role in the Napoleonic Wars, a forgotten hero finally rediscovered. These are his words. Let's begin. What in fact was actually happening? Davout continued to press forward, overrunning more and more of our left flank, while the center and right, absolutely immobile, were sacrificing small sections of infantry, cavalry, and artillery to help out the retreating left wing, not venturing anything calculated to surprise the enemy. Yet while the fighting continued, our right flank was playing a positive role and delaying a decisive defeat by affording time for Lestock's corps to arrive on the battlefield. But to take full advantage of this, we should have been propping up this flank with large numbers of men, not just small units. Bagration, who in moments of danger asserted himself through sheer willpower and innate talent, moved the reserve towards Anclapen so that it faced Davout and Saint-Hilaire. Ermolov galloped to the same spot with 36 horse-drawn guns taken from the reserve, peppered Anclapen with incendiary shells, set it immediately on fire, and forced out the enemy infantry. Major General Count Kutaisov also arrived there with 12 guns, but somewhat later. Then, not losing a moment, he made for the stream that crossed the woods and attacked the batteries that had been stationed there, thus preventing the infantry columns from moving into the woods of Anclapen or Kutchitin and reinforcing the troops pouring into the latter village. But these successes, or rather the postponement of the threatened disaster, could not last. To snatch decisive victory from the enemy, it was vital not only to halt Davout, but to defeat him by bearing down on his right flank and simultaneously threatening his rear by a general offensive against Augereau's corps and the cavalry backing up his forces. Eventually, the adjutants galloped over with news of the approach of Lestock, whom we had awaited so long and so patiently. Having kept the greater part of Ney's corps occupied by battling the brigade of General Plotz and pursuing him to Kreuzberg, Lestock turned towards Leisen, Graventen, and Altdorf with his main forces, consisting of 9 battalions and 29 squadrons. It was already around 4 p.m. The road to Altdorf was dark with troops, and Bennigsen galloped to meet them, to speed them up and to issue them his own orders. It was noticeable that with the arrival of the commander-in-chief, the entire corps began to move faster. Lestock was directed towards Schmoditten. He passed this village and, just short of Kutchitin, drew up his troops in battle order. The right column was composed of the Vyborg Infantry Regiment, the left was Rukel's regiment, and behind came the reserve. The Fobetsky Grenadier Battalion deployed in a single line. The Schoening Infantry Regiment, marching in column, bypassed the village on the left, smashed the enemy infantry positioned there, and chased them into the woods. General Kahl, with cavalry and 1 Cossack regiment, which joined him from the main body of the army, attacked the enemy cavalry posted near Kutchitin, creating havoc in the village. He then turned on the infantry fleeing for the village in disarray, destroyed the greater part of it, and prevented the survivors from escaping into the woods where their companions had found refuge. In this engagement, the Vybor regiment won back 3 cannons that the French had captured on our left flank during its retreat. Having taken possession of Kutchitin, Lestock turned his troops to the right and drew them up to face the woods. The Schoening Infantry Regiment composed his right flank, the Fobetsky Grenadier Battalion and the Vybor Regiment formed the center, and the Ruchel Regiment was on the left. A second line of defense was made up of the Wagenfeld Cuirassier Regiment and the Dragoon Regiments of Auer and Bachko. A light cavalry regiment, composed of various elements, was arranged to the left of the infantry. Our left flank, which had been retreating, halted and came to order. Its reserve, under the command of Major General Count Kamenskoy, and the reserve cavalry under Major General Chaplitz, arrived to reinforce the Prussian corps. The attack on the woods was carried out with great courage and in impeccable order. The woods were cleared partly by firearms, partly by cold steel. The moment was ripe for a combined effort by our center and the reserve against the weakened remnants of Augereau's corps, battered that morning, the Horse Guard, and the three cavalry divisions of Klein, Grouchy, and Hautpoul, which had brought together the left and right flanks of the French army. Such a combination had given victory to Napoleon at Austerlitz. But our army remained on the spot, limiting its action to a cannonade. The pressure exerted by Lestock was strengthened by the addition of his own artillery, which hammered the troops of Davout and Saint-Hilaire. Ermolov's artillery also concentrated fire along the whole enemy line from left to right. Despite this general inactivity on our side, which relied solely on the artillery barrages of Lestock and Ermolov, the enemy was unable to withstand the pressure. Their retreat, which at first began with some semblance of order, turned into inexcusable confusion. So much so, in fact, that 28 cannons, some damaged and some not, were abandoned by them on the battlefield. The coming darkness and poor intelligence did not allow the Prussian general to crown this day with these important trophies. Having left the field of battle, Davout and Saint-Hilaire drew up their troops on either side of Sosgarten. The front line and sentries were placed a few yards ahead. The whole enemy line segmented the battlefield from Sausgarten to Eylau. At Eylau, the divisions of Leval and Legrand remained at their previous stations, but 4 light cavalry brigades moved forward to the Altdorf stream to keep open the line of communication with Ney, who was then approaching Altdorf. On our side, the troops were disposed as follows. The front line, with its left wing flanking the road from Kurtschitten to Domnau, followed the stream that flowed from Anklappen and cut the woods in two. From there, the line extended from in front of Anklappen to a point alongside our central battery, which had played such an important role in the first phase of the battle. The troops of our right flank likewise adjoined this battery, as they did in their original formation prior to the battle. This defensive battle order by the opposing forces at the end of the conflict proves that neither was able to impose decisive superiority of arms over the other. Both the French and ourselves remained essentially in the positions they originally occupied, with minor changes on our left flank, which gave a little ground to Davout's corps and Saint-Hilaire's division, because the coming darkness made fighting more difficult. If we had had 1 more hour of daylight, Lestock would inevitably have taken possession of the artillery abandoned by the French and would have compelled Davout and Saint-Hilaire to retreat beyond Sausgarten. Late night deepened the darkness over the blood-saturated field of Eylau. All the surrounding villages were now in flames, and the reflection of the fires illuminated the exhausted troops, still standing under arms and awaiting further orders. Here and there, you could see campfires being lit, rallying points for thousands of crawling, wounded soldiers. The torn bodies of men and horses, broken wagons, powder cases, gun carriages, equipment and weapons, scattered here and heaped up there, gave the plain an aspect of terror and destruction worthy of the brush of the inspired creator of the last day of Pompeii, the painter Braiulov. The engagement had ended, but the minds of the leaders of both armies were gripped by uncertainty. Renew the battle or retreat to Königsberg. The more obstinate of the two finally triumphed, not because he resumed the offensive, but because he remained on the battlefield until dawn. Bennigsen departed the field around midnight, posting several squadrons to keep surveillance on the enemy and to provide a screen for the army heading for Königsberg. Lestock retired through Allenburg to Bailleau. There was no pursuit. The French, like a disabled man of war with torn sails and broken masts, bobbed about menacingly but were unable to make any headway to fight or to give chase. Suddenly we heard musket fire in Schmoditten. We were astonished. Our first thought was that it was Ney, whom we had forgotten about. Sure enough, Ney had arrived with part of his corps at Altdorf around 9 o'clock in the evening and had come across the Prussian battalion of Captain Korovsky, who, realizing the disproportion of opposing forces, had abandoned the village and joined the rest of the army. The French general Liger Belair, with the 6th and 39th regiments, followed him and entered Schmoditten village, which was filled with our wounded and covering escorts, who were there to protect them. They opened fire on the French, and a fusillade ensued. To assist them, we sent the Voronezh infantry regiment and a few cannons, but the enemy did not choose to await their arrival and retreated into Altdorf, and thus the alarm was over. On the 9th, our army, having rested in Mühlhausen, continued its march to Königsberg, stopping outside the city, having left Prince Bagration as rearguard in Ludwigswald. The French army, fearing a new battle up ahead, chose to stay put near Eylau. Only 24 squadrons moved forward to keep under observation the shores of Friesing, towards Mansfeld and Ludwigswald, and that happened only 2 days later when Napoleon was assured that our army had arrived at Pregel. On 17th February, Napoleon decided to retreat behind the river Passage to take up his winter quarters. He left Eylau, pursued by our vanguard and all the Cossack regiments under the command of their leader, Hetman Platov, who from that day forward won his European reputation. The French withdrawal was no less costly in many respects than the enforced retreat 5 years later from Moscow to the Niemen River, even though the weather was only moderately cold. And although the French later ascribed their losses after Eylau to the cold, few people nowadays believe that to be true. Being in the vanguard myself, I was witness to the bloody trail from Eylau to Gutstadt. The whole road was littered continuously with debris. Hundreds of dying horses obstructed our path, as well as ambulances filled with dying or dead soldiers and officers, mutilated in the Battle of Eylau. The rush to get away had become so urgent that besides the victims left in the carriages, we found many who had been simply dumped in the snow without covering or clothes, bleeding to death. For mile after mile, they lay not in pairs but in tens and hundreds. Moreover, all the villages along the way were filled with sick and wounded, without doctors or food or the least care. In this pursuit, the Cossacks captured many exhausted men and scavengers, as well as 8 artillery pieces, stuck in the snow without harnesses. Our losses in this battle amounted to almost half of the number of the fighting men, that is to say, 37,000 men killed or wounded. According to the military registers, our army was apparently composed of 46,800 men, regular army, and 2,500 Cossacks. Such losses have never been equaled in military annals since the invention of gunpowder. The reader can imagine the extent of the casualties in the French army, since they possessed a smaller force of artillery than ours and were beaten back in 2 fierce assaults by our center and the left flank. Our trophies consisted of 9 eagles seized from the enemy ranks and 2,000 prisoners. The Prussian king was presented with 2 eagles. I was involved in a touching episode after the battle. 14 months previously, our army had been defeated at Austerlitz. The Horse Guard regiment shared the defeat along with the others. My own brother, then a 20-year-old youth who served with this regiment, was grievously wounded. He received 5 saber cuts, 1 bullet wound, and a bayonet thrust, and had been left for dead in a mound of corpses on the battlefield. There he lay until late at night. He regained consciousness in the dark, got up, and somehow hobbled towards a fire in a nearby village, which he found overflowing with Russian wounded, among whom he found shelter. After 3 days, 2 men from his regiment, who had sustained much lighter wounds, Arapov and Barkovsky, persuaded him to set off with them to find our retreating army. Not really knowing which direction it had taken, they wandered about in the typical manner of men exhausted by suffering and hunger. Their journey did not last very long. A squadron of mounted grenadiers of the Guard, detached from the French army to collect the wounded from both sides, overtook them and informed them of their fate. There was nothing to be done about it. The squadron continued on, but its commanding officer arranged for my brother and his 2 comrades to be conveyed to Brunn, where Napoleon's headquarters were located. As our proverb says, however, poor folk get lost, but God looks after them. This particular officer was 2nd Lieutenant Serugs, a nephew of Minister Marat, Duke of Bassano. The life or death of my brother depended on his mercy. I say life or death because the reciprocal hatred of the French and the Russians dated from about that time. The soldiers of both armies had adopted the habit of stripping prisoners of their last clothes and their boots and leaving them to die, overcome by hunger and exhaustion, cold, or wounds. Although this was not part of a system ordered from above, such acts were never questioned by superiors. A humane and compassionate man, Serugs had not yet been infected by this loathsome practice. Taking a heartfelt interest in the misfortune of his prisoner, he showed compassion. He even forbade him to walk on foot, mounted him on a horse, and seeing how weak he was from hunger, shared with him his last morsel of bread. Thus, he brought him to the pasture of the nearest village, saw to it that he was properly fed, got a cart ready for him, and sent him on to Brunn, encouraging him with a friendly, almost fraternal concern. Moreover, he gave his word to my brother that he would look for him and find him again in Brunn, where he hoped to return shortly. But failing that, he made him promise to apply to his uncle, Minister Maret, for all necessary assistance. All this I learned from my brother upon his return from captivity, and a few weeks before I myself left to join the army. Having arrived with the rearguard at Ludwigswald on 29th of January, I begged permission from Bagration to visit Königsberg on personal business and duly quartered myself with General Chaplitz, who had been appointed commander of the city. Chaplitz told me that there was a French officer wounded in the last engagement who was making inquiries about me, asking whether anyone knew Davidov, a lieutenant of the guard. I was the only guard officer by that name in the whole army, and, curious to discover the identity of this French officer, I asked to see the list of prisoners of rank. You can imagine my surprise when the name of second lieutenant of the Horse Guard Regiment, Seruges, leaped out at me the instant I opened the enormous folio. In a flash, I was off to find this man, whose face I had never seen, but whom I already considered a devoted brother and lifelong friend. The inhabitants of Königsberg, incidentally, had learned of the arrival of our army under their walls and feared that, if we retreated further, their city would eventually be occupied by the French. Therefore, to earn the favor of Napoleon beforehand, they begged Bennigsen for permission to divide themselves up, to provide quarters for the wounded French officers, and keep them in their homes at their expense. Needless to say, the nephew of the minister was treated with special favor. Serugs enjoyed the hospitality of one of the wealthiest citizens of Königsberg. I found him in a tall, luxuriously appointed house, the first floor of what had been put at his disposal, a bed with a large canopy, choice linen, screens, small tables and sofas, comfortable armchairs, semi-darkness, and fragrant incense, a doctor and medicines. Nothing was lacking. But he lay there pale, worn out, and in great pain. Several sword slashes on his head and arms did not trouble him as much as a deep, and, as it proved, mortal wound to the groin. I approached the bed of the unfortunate patient quietly and told him my name. We embraced as true blood brothers. He asked about mine with genuine concern. I thanked him for having saved my brother and offered my services with deep emotion. He answered me, "You see, I am in the care of a good person and do not lack for anything. However, you can do me a great service. Undoubtedly, among the prisoners, there are some wounded from my outfit. Could you possibly appeal to the authorities and arrange for 2, or even 1, of my horse grenadiers to remain by my side? Let me die still resting my eyes to the end on the uniform of my regiment and the guard of a great man." It goes without saying that I rushed to see Bennigsen and Chaplitz and obtained their permission to choose from the crowd of prisoners 2 horse grenadiers from Serugs' own squad. Within 2 hours, I returned to him, accompanied by 2 mustachioed fellows, crowned with bearskin hats and in full uniform. It is impossible to describe the joy of my ill-fated friend at the sight of his comrades in arms. I had to cut short his expressions of gratitude, too exhausting in his condition. For 2 days, I did not leave his side, day or night. On the 3rd, everything came to an end. He died in my arms and was buried in the Königsberg cemetery. Behind the casket walked the 2 aforementioned French horse grenadiers and myself, a second lieutenant of the Russian Guard. A strange juxtaposition of uniforms. Deep sorrow was clearly etched on the faces of the old veterans, my companions in the procession. I, who was young, wept. That concludes the 4th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content.